Hello, this is Modern Alternate History, and today we are exploring what if the funny mustache man got into art school. Before we start, please like and subscribe. Thank you. In this timeline, Hitler got accepted into art school and never went into German politics. This results in the Nazi Party being less popular and much more divided. I believe that the party would probably split between the left and the right. The right would then probably join the DNVP, another far-right party who wants to bring back the monarchy. It does not actually matter that much if they do bring it back or not. I believe they'd be much more moderate due to the party being overall more moderate. This leads to the party being more pacifist in the way of not wanting a direct conflict with the West and not being so genocidal. I believe Anschluss would still happen due to the Pan-Germanic movement still happening. The Sudeten crisis would still happen, and the Allies would probably still give it up in hopes of appeasing Germany and gaining them as an ally against the Soviet Union. The Sudeten crisis would probably still happen, although this Germany would be much more willing to cooperate and would probably not invade. This means that Czechoslovakia would survive, although losing many territories. Hungary invades and gains southern Slovakia and Carpathian Ruthenia, and Poland takes their disputed territory. Soon Slovakia would declare independence, which results in Germany gaining a lot of influence in Czechia and Slovakia. The Germans would very likely still demand Danzig, although in a more diplomatic approach by defending the Poles in a Soviet invasion and by giving up their demands for old imperial territories. Also in a secret clause, the Germans offered to help the Poles invade Poland and reform the Commonwealth. The question now is, do they accept or refuse? Because there are pros and cons for both of them. First, we will look at the scenario where they refuse, then where they accept. If the Polish refuse, Germany would probably still declare war on them due to the imperial territories being very important to Germany. The initial invasion would suit massively for Germany was in their hands reach, but the wild card is the Soviets would probably intervene due to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact never happening due to this government being even more anti-communist and less pragmatic. The Soviets mobilize their troops and make a counter-offensive in northern Poland. The Soviets, in exchange for helping Poland, would gain Belarusian territories, and the Polish would also have to invite communists to the government, turning Poland into a de facto Soviet puppet. The Soviets would get many other smaller nations involved by pressuring them to join, then demanding they add communists to their government to gain influence in those nations. Meanwhile, the Allies could do nothing due to not wanting to anger Stalin. The Soviets would also demand Bessarabia from Romania. The Germans did not have enough power in 1939 to fight a two-front war, and the Soviets would push into the Carpathians and the French into the Rhine. The Germans would try to set up a defense on the other side of the Rhine. The Germans fail setting up a defense near the Rhine, and the French push through. Meanwhile, the Russians have taken eastern Prussia and encircled Königsberg. Most of Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland have fallen to the Soviets, and the offensive only continues. The German government would be forced to surrender, and it is very unlikely it will end like our World War II, due to the war not being as long and Germany being more willing to make peace. The French would have already captured a lot of Germany, so it would not matter even if they did continue fighting. The peace treaty would yield Germany losing the Rhineland to the French. The French then set up a puppet government, and maybe they even annexed the Saarland. The Germans would lose Sudetenland and Silesia to Czechoslovakia and eastern Prussia to Poland. Germany would once again be made a democracy, and another republic would be declared. Also, there would probably be new reparations put on Germany, and the EU would probably never exist due to the Franco-German rivalry would never disappear, although NATO would probably still exist in some form. Probably more like an anti-Soviet pact. The Soviets would create an alliance similar to the real-world Warsaw Pact, in which would be alongside the Soviets, the Poles, the Czechoslovaks, the Romanians, and the Hungarians. Meanwhile, Finland would be pressured to be neutral and give military access to the Soviets in case of a war. On the western side, which would be a lot more split, are the French, the Benelux nations, the Rhenish, the Germans, the Italians, and the Portuguese and Spanish. There are a few neutral nations as well, but this is about it. This Cold War would probably be very different, with the Western powers being more imperialist, and there is much more infighting. This Cold War would probably be focused on the many colonized nations trying to free themselves from the British and the French. But what if Poland had accepted? because they had many reasons, for example, defense against the Soviets and territorial expansion. The Polsi and Germans would accept the German demand in exchange for a secret protocol for the Polish to gain western Ukraine and Belarus and Lithuania. The Germans and Polish invade Lithuania so that Poland can reform the Commonwealth, and so that Poland can get an access to the sea. The Lithuanians would be crushed along with any resistance. There, however, is a small chance the Allies join this war, however, that is doubtful, but if it were to happen, it would be a near repeat of Scenario 1. The following treaty would result in Poland gaining Lithuania and reforming the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the Germans giving up their claim to Memel, so the Poles can have a usable port. The Germans would organize the Vienna treaties in this timeline, as well, although being less harsher on Romania in my opinion, due to the monarchy being favored more by the DNVP. The Romanians would be promised protection and territories in modern-day Vinnytsia and Odessa. Yugoslavia would also get carved up, but unlike in our timeline, the anti-German coup would not happen due to the Germans being less insane and anti-Slav, and also more favorable to the monarchy. The Germans would gain Slovenia, the Italians Dalmatia, the Bulgarians Macedonia, and Hungary Vojvodina. The Yugoslavs would gain northern Albania as compensation. A conflict would probably erupt between the Germans and Soviets sometime in 1940, for example. In this timeline, the starting point could be the Winter War, or the Soviets invade the Baltics or Bessarabia. The point is, it is very likely a war will erupt. The Germans would militarily be a bit weaker due to not having as many men, but the Soviet purges would be fresher as well. Also, the Germans do not have to occupy most of Europe and actually get help from the nationalist forces. Probably whites and Ukrainian nationalists would join the side of the Germans, which would help tremendously. Because of the reasons listed before, and also the Germans having a larger border that is nearer to the big cities, they manage a very successful offensive into Russia. Many units are encircled and destroyed, and many Partians are working against the Soviets. The Germans have taken the western side of the Dnieper fully under their control. The Germans would continue their offensive and conquer Moscow due to the tank divisions not being diverted to Ukraine. Leningrad is also taken into siege, and the Finns would be more willing to cooperate with Germany due to them not being in war with the Allies and being less radical. The Soviets manage a successful counterattack, and many territories are lost, but many men who in our timeline died did not in this one. The winter has mostly frozen the battles. First, I believe the Germans would still make an offensive to the Caucasus, although they could get oil from the Allies who are neutral in this conflict, although I doubt that. Also, Leningrad would be captured due to the Finns advancing on it, rather than in our timeline where they just sat by fearing Soviet and Allied retaliation. Stalingrad would be taken due to the army not being as moronic as Hitler, and due to the tanks not being diverted, again. The final offensive would be a sort of last push, and after recapturing Moscow, the Soviet government collapsed with Stalin committing suicide. The Germans stopped there, seeing no point in continuing a long and costly war in Siberia. In the USSR, a power struggle would happen between Beria and Zhukov due to both being the ones with most power. I believe Zhukov and the army would coup the government, but in the Far East, the Japanese would invade, which would be followed by a U.S. invasion resulting in a puddle of warlord states such as the Russian fascists, monarchists, and etc. The US would set up a liberal Russian republic. Poland would gain Belarus, and western Ukraine and Romania would gain Odessa. The Germans would set up friendly governments in Ukraine, the Donkuban region, and the Caucasian region. Most of the Russian territories would be formed into the Russine Empire with a Romanov at its head, although there is a chance that a German monarch is placed there. Whatever the case, the Germans rule Russia as practically a colony, getting from Russia cheap labor and production. The Finns would gain most of Karelia, but Murmansk would probably stay in Soviet hands due to it being sufficiently well defended. The factions would be the authoritarian Reichspakt and the progressive NATO. I believe this Cold War would be very interesting, but I do believe the West will eventually win due to a few factors. First, the Polish and Russian regions are still unstable due to Poland being very multi-ethnic and Russia due to being treated as a colony rather than an ally. It does not matter who unifies Russia, anyway the Russians will want to reclaim their birthland. Also, many members of the Reichspakt would not be there out of their will, such as Bulgaria and Yugoslavia. Spain would be forced to not join the pact due to French fears of being encircled. The Cold War would probably still end at West victory. Also, a bit about Asia, a communist China would never rise, but that would not mean China is besties with the US now. Thanks for watching. Please leave a like and subscribe.